Ever wonder what real moments shaped the private side of one of Hollywood's most watched lives? From the intense early spark with Winona Ryder that led to a tattoo and shared screen time in Edward Scissorhands, through the long chapter with Vanessa Paradis and their 2 children, the highly publicized marriage to Amber Heard, and the more recent quiet links to Yulia Vlasova spotted across Europe, Johnny Depp's dating history holds stories of honest connections, quiet turns, and simple human choices. This walk through the timeline stays grounded in what he and others have shared in interviews over the years, focusing on the natural flow of real relationships rather than any forced spotlight. The story of Johnny Depp's relationships begins in the late 80s when he first crossed paths with Winona Ryder at the premiere of Great Balls of Fire, and later described that initial look as a classic glance that made everything else grow foggy, a moment he shared years afterward in a Rolling Stone interview where he spoke of an immediate sense that something different was unfolding between them. They were introduced properly through mutual friends and soon began spending time together. While both were rising in their careers, the pair went on to star opposite each other in Edward Scissorhands, directed by Tim Burton, a film that captured a quiet tenderness on screen that many viewers felt mirrored the real connection forming off-camera. Within 5 months of dating they became engaged, and Depp marked the commitment with a tattoo on his arm that read "Winona Forever," a permanent reminder of how deeply he felt at the time. The relationship lasted about 4 years, filled with the usual pressures of young fame, travel and intense schedules, until they parted ways in 1993. Winona later reflected in an interview that it had been her first real breakup and first heartbreak, noting the irony of appearing to have everything while feeling lost inside. Yet she has also spoken of him as someone she knew as a good, loving and protective person who was never abusive toward her, a recollection that stands as one of the clearer personal accounts from that chapter. After the split, Depp adjusted the tattoo to read "Winona Forever," turning a private ending into a small public joke that still gets mentioned when people look back on those early years. The next stretch of his dating life moved through a series of shorter connections, including time spent with Kate Moss beginning around 1994. After they were introduced in New York, the two were often photographed together during a period when both were navigating high-visibility careers, and their relationship carried the energy of the mid-90s fashion and film worlds until it ended a few years later. Around the same time, he was linked with Ellen Barkin while working on Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, though those periods remained less defined in public statements. Then came the longer and more settled chapter with Vanessa Paradis, the French singer and actress whom he met while filming The Ninth Gate in Paris. In the late 90s their relationship stretched across 14 years, the longest continuous partnership of his adult life, and brought 2 children, Lily Rose born in 1999 and Jack born in 2002, into the picture. Depp has spoken in interviews about the grounding effect of family life during those years, describing the quiet routines of raising kids away from constant cameras and the way their shared time in France and elsewhere offered a different rhythm from the earlier Hollywood spotlight. The pair separated amicably in 2012, with both noting that demanding careers and the natural passage of time played roles in the decision rather than any single dramatic break. They have continued to co-parent and appear together at family events over the years, showing a steady if private respect that many observers have pointed to as a quieter success within the broader timeline. After the separation from Paradis, attention shifted toward Amber Heard, whom Depp had first met years earlier on the set of The Rum Diary in 2009 during filming of a scene that involved a kiss. He later recalled in court testimony that something unexpected registered in that moment, a feeling he said he should not have been experiencing while still committed elsewhere. The professional connection stayed platonic for a time until after his split from Paradis, when the two began seeing each other more regularly. They became engaged in 2014 and married in a private ceremony in February 2015, first in a civil event and then with a small gathering on his island property in the Bahamas. The marriage lasted roughly 15 months before Heard filed for divorce in May 2016. The years that followed brought intense public scrutiny, legal filings and a high-profile defamation trial in 2022 where both sides presented their accounts of the relationship's difficulties. Depp has maintained, through interviews and statements, that he never struck her and has described the entire period as one of the most painful chapters of his life, while also expressing gratitude for the support support that arrived from fans and from people who had known him longer, including Kate Moss, who testified about their earlier years together. The trial itself became a global conversation, but Depp has repeatedly said in later comments that he prefers to look forward rather than remain locked in the past, and that the experience taught him the value of privacy and of surrounding himself with people who understand the weight of public judgment. In the time since that chapter closed, he has kept his personal life largely out of the headlines, with only occasional reports of low-key connections. One of those links has involved the Russian model and entrepreneur Yulia Vlasova, based in Prague, whom he first met around 2021 at the Karlovy Vary International Film Festival. According to accounts that circulated when photos of them together began appearing years later, the pair were spotted in various European cities, including Prague, where Depp was working on projects, and later in London, with sources close to the situation describing the connection as casual and without formal labels. Neither has issued a public confirmation of a relationship, and Vlasova has generally preferred to keep personal matters private, yet the sightings and the occasional social media moments have kept the speculation alive into 2026 as Depp continues to focus on music with the Hollywood vampires, film work, and the quieter routines of a life that has already spanned decades of intense attention. Looking across the full arc, from the early intensity with Winona Ryder through the long family years with Vanessa Paradis, the public turbulence of the marriage to Amber Heard, and the more recent understated presence of Yulia Vlasova, what stands out is less a series of perfect stories and more a collection of real human stretches, each shaped by the particular moment in which it arrived: the pressures of fame, the demands of work, the arrival of children, the simple need for connection, and the eventual recognition that some chapters end so others can begin. Depp himself has rarely offered sweeping summaries, preferring instead brief, honest reflections in interviews where he talks about learning from each experience without claiming any of them were flawless. The tattoo that once declared forever and then became a wry joke, the years spent raising two children largely out of the spotlight, the courtroom moments that forced old wounds into public view, and the current preference for keeping new connections low-key, all form part of a timeline that feels less like a polished narrative and more like the ordinary uneven path most people travel, only under brighter lights and longer lenses. What remains consistent in the accounts that have surfaced over the years is a man who has repeatedly spoken of valuing loyalty, creativity, and the small everyday moments that survive after the cameras leave. And while the public continues to revisit these chapters with fresh curiosity, the people who live them have for the most part chosen to move forward, carrying the lessons rather than the noise. Continuing from those quieter choices, the full picture of Johnny Depp, stating history keeps revealing itself in the smaller details that have surfaced over decades of interviews and public records, rather than in any single dramatic headline. After the early intensity with Winona Ryder and the long stretch with Vanessa Paradis, the years surrounding the marriage to Amber Heard and the later low-key presence of Yulia Vlasova form a sequence that shows how public attention can both amplify and distort ordinary human turns. Depp has spoken in various interviews about the way fame compresses time, making brief connections feel larger than they were and long ones feel shorter than they lasted. One recurring theme, in his own words, is the value he places on loyalty and the quiet routines that outlast the spotlight. For example, during the 14 years with Vanessa Paradis, he often described the simple pleasure of ordinary days spent with their children Lily Rose and Jack, away from red carpets, choosing locations in France and elsewhere that allowed a measure of normalcy even as his film career continued at a high pace. Those years included the usual challenges of balancing work schedules, travel, and parenting, yet both he and Paradis have indicated in separate comments that the decision to separate in 2012 came from a mutual recognition that their lives had moved in different directions rather than from bitterness or public conflict. The amicable nature of that ending has allowed them to remain present for their children and to appear together at family occasions without the kind of ongoing friction that often follows high-profile splits. That same preference for privacy appears again in the more recent chapter involving Yulia Vlasova, the Prague-based model and beautician who first crossed paths with Depp at the Karlovy Vary International Film Festival in 2021. Reports of them spending time together in European cities have circulated since 2024, yet neither has confirmed a formal relationship, and sources familiar with the situation have consistently described it as casual with no labels applied. The absence of joint statements or public declarations stands in contrast to earlier periods when engagements and marriages were announced more openly, and it suggests a deliberate choice to keep new connections out of the constant glare. Looking back further, the connection with Winona Ryder remains one of the most frequently referenced early chapters, not only because of the shared work on Edward Scissorhands but because of the tangible mark it left. The tattoo that began began as Winona Forever and later became Wino. Forever has been mentioned by Depp himself in interviews as both a sincere gesture at the time and a later reminder of how feelings can shift. He has never framed the relationship as perfect, instead acknowledging the intensity of young love under public eyes and the natural ending that followed after roughly 4 years. Winona's own later comments describing it as her first real heartbreak while also characterizing him as protective and caring have provided a balanced personal account that avoids the extremes sometimes projected onto celebrity stories. The period that followed included the mid-90s years with Kate Moss, a connection that carried the energy of that era's fashion and music scenes. The two were photographed together frequently, yet when it ended around 1998, both moved forward without extensive public post-mortems. Depp has occasionally referenced those years in broader reflections on the pressures of constant visibility, noting that the combination of youth, career momentum and external attention can make even ordinary disagreements feel magnified. The arrival of family life with Paradis offered a different rhythm, and in interviews he has spoken of how becoming a father changed his priorities, emphasizing the everyday responsibilities of raising children over the more transient aspects of fame. The contrast between that long-settled period and the shorter, more public marriage to Amber Heard is often noted by observers, yet Depp's own statements during and after the 2022 trial have focused less on assigning lasting blame and more on the personal cost of having private difficulties examined under intense scrutiny. He has described the experience as painful and has expressed appreciation for the support that came from longtime friends and from fans who chose to look at the fuller picture rather than isolated claims. In the years since, he has largely stepped back from detailed commentary on that chapter, preferring to channel energy into creative work. Music performances with the Hollywood vampires in selective film projects the pattern that emerges across the entire timeline, from the late 80s glance with Winona Ryder through the family years, the highly examined marriage, and the current understated links is one of a person navigating the same basic human needs for connection, loyalty and growth that anyone faces, only under conditions where every step is recorded and revisited. The real moments that stand out in the accounts are not grand declarations but quieter ones: the decision to alter a tattoo after a relationship ends, the choice to co-parent without ongoing conflict, the preference for keeping newer connections private, and the consistent return to creative work as a steadying force. Depp has rarely offered neat summaries of his dating history, instead allowing the individual chapters to speak through the limited personal comments he has chosen to share. Over time, those comments often return to themes of learning from each experience without claiming perfection, and of valuing the people who remain present after the public interest fades. In that sense, the full story from Winona Ryder to Amber Heard to Yulia Vlasova is less a polished sequence of successes or failures and more a record of real turns taken under bright lights, each shaped by the particular circumstances of age, career demands and a simple desire for honest connection. The audience that follows these chapters often brings its own expectations, seeking either idealization or condemnation, yet the available interviews and public records point toward a more ordinary reality: a person who has experienced intense early romance, long-term partnership, public conflict and quieter later chapters, while continuing to prioritize the private spaces where genuine relationships can develop without constant external commentary. That emphasis on privacy has become more pronounced in recent years as Depp has focused on music tours, film work, and the everyday routines that exist beyond the headlines. The links to Yulia Vlasova fit within that pattern. Reports of shared time in Prague and London remain speculative in the absence of confirmation, and the lack of formal announcements suggests a mutual preference for keeping whatever connection exists outside the cycle of intense scrutiny that marked earlier periods. This approach aligns with comments Depp has made in interviews about the value of ordinary moments and the difficulty of maintaining them when every public appearance generates new speculation. The earlier chapters provide context for that preference. The relationship with Winona Ryder unfolded at a time when both were still establishing their careers, and the combination of shared work, personal intensity and public fascination created a story that continues to be retold decades later. The years with Vanessa Paradis offered a longer stretch of relative stability centered on family, yet even that period existed under the awareness that public interest never fully disappears. The marriage to Amber Heard brought the most intense examination of private difficulties, and the subsequent legal process forced a level of disclosure that Depp has since indicated he would prefer to leave behind. What ties these different stages together is not a single unbroken narrative of romance, but a series of distinct human experiences, each carrying its own lessons and each filtered through the particular lens of fame. The consistent thread in Depp's own reflections is a focus on loyalty, creativity, and the small daily choices that define a life more than any public public milestone does, whether speaking about the early tattoo, the responsibilities of fatherhood, the cost of public conflict, or the decision to keep newer connections low-key. He has tended to emphasize the personal rather than the performative. That stance has allowed the dating history to remain grounded in real moments rather than forced narratives, and it invites audiences to approach the timeline with the same balance, looking for the honest reactions and simple storytelling that make any life relatable even when lived under constant observation. As the years continue, the full arc from the late 80s through the mid-2000s and into the present keeps expanding, with each new chapter adding texture rather than rewriting what came before. The presence of Yulia Vlasova in recent reports represents one more turn in a long sequence, a connection that remains undefined in public terms and therefore free from the weight of earlier expectations. Whether it develops further or remains casual, the choice to keep it private reflects the lessons carried from previous relationships and the ongoing preference for spaces where genuine interaction can occur without the pressure of constant external judgment. In the end, the story of Johnny Depp's relationships, from Winona Ryder to Amber Heard to Yulia Vlasova, is the story of a person moving through the ordinary complexities of connection under extraordinary conditions, learning, adjusting, and continuing forward with the same basic human needs that define any dating history, only with a larger audience watching each step of this walk through Johnny Depp's dating history, from the early days with Winona Ryder through the long chapter with Vanessa Paradis, the public years with Amber Heard, and the more recent quiet links to Yulia Vlasova, left you thinking about the real moments that shape any life under bright lights. Take a second to share which chapter stood out most to you in the comments. Your thoughts help keep the conversation honest and grounded. If you want more stories told this way with simple details and no forced drama, stay close for the next one.